For our project, we researched significant events in the history of the Soviet Union, then made a presentation with Tetris blocks to represent the events. We chose Tetris blocks because of its historical ties to the Soviet Union. Did you know it was created in 1984 by a Soviet software engineer? The Tetris blocks represent how the significant events are interconnected and how they affect each other, and how even once some of the events have passed, there are still lasting impacts on both the present and the future. With that being said, here are our 10 significant events of the Soviet Union. Enjoy!
World War I was an event which affected many countries around the world, including Russia. Russia first joined the war in defense of Serbia, and it fought alongside the Allies. However, Russia's military was ill-equipped for the war, and as a result, Russia ended up having a considerable amount of debt after the war, and millions of Russians died. This led to many people becoming increasingly unhappy with the situation in the country. World War I showed the inadequacy of the Tsar's leadership, as well as the flaws in the economic, social, and military systems in Russia, which led to many people becoming dissatisfied with the way the country was running at the time. The Russian Revolution was another event which was significant to the history of the Soviet Union, as many of the workers and peasants supported the Bolsheviks in the revolution since they sought to change the country and the systems that were in place. This event was also seen as the potential start of a communist movement in the world, and many predicted that this event would have lasting impacts on the people in Russia. The Russian Revolution led to the end of the Romanov dynasty and the end of the feudal system in Russia, since the Bolsheviks came into power, and they changed many things in the country for people as they redistributed the land, nationalized the banks, and increased wages, among other things. This event also led to the Russian Civil War and the creation of the Soviet Union, which became a world power in conflicts like World War II and the Cold War. The Russian Revolution was also a spark and source of inspiration for workers' rights movements in other countries. The Russian Revolution indicated a growing worldwide labor movement and a movement for communism and socialism around the world. It also showed that feudalism and monarchy was becoming outdated, as it couldn't adapt to the modern ways of the world, and in order to address flaws in the systems in their country, the Russian people decided to turn to communism.
Shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia was tossed into a civil war that was divided into two sides. The Tsarist Whites, who had royalist ideals, and the Bolshevik Reds, who supported Marx and his communist beliefs. It was a major war that decided the fate of the country's politics, communism or capitalism. Though the Whites had external support from the Allies, who were imperialist and capitalist, the Reds ultimately won through the support from the people, who heavily supported the Reds, which led to the formation of the Soviet Union. It revealed that Russia and its people were about to start a new form of government, one that finally included the lower class in the first time in its country's history. After the establishment of the Soviet Union, war communism was replaced by Lenin's new economic policy, which allowed the coexistence of private and public sectors, so there were some capitalist elements. However, a few years later, Lenin died and Stalin came into power. He implemented the 5-year plans, which allowed the Soviet Union to industrialize at a rapid pace, and it greatly improved the economy. Prior to the 5-year plan, Russia was an agricultural state, and industrialization in the country was slow at best. With Stalin's plan in place, Russia would direct its efforts away from farming into industrialization instead. Farms were collectivized, and the kulak class, which was a class of wealthier peasants with a certain amount of land, was destroyed, further ensuring that all people would be equal in the Soviet Union. The 5-year plan led to rapid industrialization, new railways, factories, and power stations that were built by the people. During the Soviet times, it was believed that industrialization was what allowed the Soviets to defeat the Germans in the Eastern Front in World War II. During this period, however, is also known as Stalin's Great Purge or the Great Terror. During this period, people who resisted the new policies were sent to gulags or executed, which resulted in the deaths of around 1 million people. Though the methods executed by the Soviet government were extreme, the results that were reaped pushed the Soviet Union into a world as a formidable force.
World War II is another event that is significant to the Soviet Union's history. The USSR helped the Allies fight against the Axis powers during the Second World War. After massive industrialization in the 1930s, the Soviet Union became a much stronger country than they were during the First World War. They grew militarily and economically. On the Eastern Front, the USSR defeated Germany and held the front in battles such as the Battle of Stalingrad. The USSR supported the Allies and contributed to the onset of the war. The Soviet Union was able to produce a large enough military to push back the Germans, who had highly advanced technology at the time. The Second World War showed people that the Soviets were much stronger than they were in the earlier decades. The Soviet Union later became recognized as a superpower after their successes in the war. After the Second World War, ideological and political differences between the two biggest world powers at the time, the US and the Soviet Union, caused tensions to increase between the two countries. Although the countries never directly fought in a war, there were many proxy wars during this period, one of the first being the Korean War in the 1950s. During the Korean War, the USSR backed the North, while the US backed the South. The Korean War resulted in the division of Korea into North Korea and South Korea. It also caused relations between the USSR and the West to deteriorate. It showed the growing tensions between the US and USSR as more communist governments began appearing around the world. As well, it showed how a country could become divided as two different political ideals existed within it. It also showed that the United States and the Soviet Union were both economically capable of supplying military reinforcements to their respective allies and showed that they could fight each other through a third country.
Among the many fronts of the Cold War, the space race was easily considered one of the most significant events that happened, especially from a technological and scientific standpoint. It was a colder side to the Cold War, and the USA and USSR spent billions of dollars in an attempt to beat each other into outer space. The Soviet Union was the first to make a breakthrough with their Sputnik, a brilliant display of their technological and economical capabilities to the world. What followed was a series of achievements: first man in space, first dog in space, first man on the moon. Had the Soviet Union remained in its monarchy society, this would not have been something that could have been possible. However, this event only stretched the tension between the two global superpowers even further, which eventually led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which was perhaps the most well-known event within the Cold War, was the height of tension between US and the USSR at the time, and was the closest the world had come to nuclear warfare. People in the US and the USSR, as well as neighboring countries, and Cuba and Turkey, who had ICBMs, were worried that this event would lead to nuclear war, and for good reason. What resulted from the Cuban Missile Crisis was that the USSR agreed to remove missiles from Cuba if the US promised not to invade Cuba, as well as removing its missiles from Turkey. Many people didn't know about this secret deal that the US and the USSR had made, so Khrushchev's reputation was damaged in the Soviet Union. And many people, especially citizens of the Soviet Union, saw the deal of the missile removal as a retreat by the Soviets and therefore a win for the USA. 2 years later, Khrushchev lost his seat of power. It revealed that many people didn't actually want to go to nuclear war despite having all of these missiles, and that mutually assured destruction was devastating enough on paper that no one dared to actually try it out.
The Chernobyl disaster is another event significant to the Soviet Union's history. Although initially it was not reported by the Soviet Union, People around the world and within the country itself soon discovered that this event had occurred. A few days after the accident, the radiation levels became high enough that it was detected in Sweden. It was soon realized that a nuclear accident had occurred within the Soviet Union. Once the event became known to the public, newspapers around the world reported on this major nuclear meltdown. Less than 100 deaths occurred. However, radioactive contamination in the area caused health problems to the people who had lived near the Chernobyl plant. As well, people living in Pripyat, a town a few miles away from the plant, were evacuated and could not return home as the levels of radiation were too dangerous. There was also environmental damage due to the radioactive contamination, which could last thousands of years. The Chernobyl disaster brought international and domestic pressure to the USSR to change their nuclear safety policies. This event also hastened the collapse of the USSR due to economic and political effects. The Chernobyl disaster showed flaws in the Soviet nuclear plant safety, as well as how nuclear power could be very dangerous if plant safety isn't regulated well enough. It also showed aspects of the USSR as they tried to hide the disaster initially, despite the severity of the accident. People in the area weren't notified of the accident or told to evacuate until a day later, so they were exposed to the radiation for some time. The actions of the Soviet Union suggest that they prioritized their reputation over the safety of the citizens.
After much of the funding directed towards the space race, ICBMs, in Chernobyl, the Soviet Union faced an economic crisis. Gorbachev, the leader at the time, sought to find solutions to the problems by attempting two things: perestroika, which means restructuring, and glasnost, which means openness. He attempted to do an economic reform, but it did not improve the economic conditions and actually ended up leading to the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, as well as the dissolution of the Soviet Union. As the situation in the USSR deteriorated due to economic decline, Gorbachev attempted something new. He allowed elections with a multi-party system, as well as changing the foreign policy of USSR. He opened the borders, allowing for people to enter and exit the country more freely, as well as granting more transparency for the country. With the democratization of Eastern Europe, the end of the Cold War drew close. Several years later, a coup was formed against Gorbachev, overthrowing him and forcing him to resign. With the end of the USSR, the Soviet Union was no longer a superpower, and with the dissolving of the Soviet Union, the Cold War ended.
The Soviet Union was impactful on a global level and also changed the lives of many people living in Russia and other countries which became part of the USSR. Stalin's industrialization of the country improved conditions for many people and allowed the Soviet Union to become a world superpower as the economy and military developed. Even though communism and the Soviet Union are often portrayed in a negative light in Western media, the USSR improved conditions for many Russians, especially those in the lower class. Communism was something that allowed people to benefit from each other instead of having the fierce competition of capitalism and money be a driving factor. In the Soviet Union, communism allowed for cooperation and unity between citizens, which strengthened the country overall because the people worked together rather than against each other like in capitalist countries. According to someone who lived in the Soviet Union, people had state-supplied housing, equal salaries, a sense of unity, and close-knit communities. These are some of the conditions that cause some Russians today to idolize the Soviet Union and long for Russia to return to the Soviet era. Although the Soviet Union only existed for about 70 years, the country had a profound impact on Russian and world history. To this day, it remains as a monument to the greatness that Russia once held on the world stage.